The north wind came down clean off the bighorns, lifting dust from Sagebrush Crossing and setting the saloon's tin sign to clacking like a tooth in a whiskey jaw. Elizabeth O'Rourke, Lizzie, back in Missouri when there'd been laughter. Enough to shorten a name tightened her faded shawl and kept walking. She had a stitch in her side and 3 coins to her name. The coins made a small, sorry noise in her pocket, like birds pecking at an empty plate. Sagebrush Crossing wasn't much to look at. A clapboard hotel with a tilted balcony, a livery that smelled of worn hay and old leather, a church that leaned a little into the prevailing wind, and a row of false front stores painted in the hopeful colors of men who believed prosperity could be nailed in place cream. Sky blue, a brave green already blanching with dust. Smoke lifted from the cafe's chimney and carried the holy scent of coffee and drippings. Lizzie's stomach made a noise she tried to turn into a polite cough. "Ma'am?" A boy with a broom stood on the cafe stoop. He couldn't have been more than 12. "We're out of room just now. Round-up men filled every chair at sunup. You might try after dinner." "I'm only a skin about work," Lizzie said, the wind taking the strength out of her voice. "I can scrub, mend, wash dishes." The boy looked over his shoulder into the steam and clatter. A woman's voice answered without turning. "No room for strays. Tell her to try the church." The broom made an apologetic scrape. "Sorry, ma'am." Lizzie nodded and kept walking because pride was lighter than begging and easier to carry on an empty stomach. She'd walked from Fort Laramie on boot heels worn to the nail, sleeping in line shacks and under cottonwoods when she could find them. A man in a freight wagon had given her a ride as far as the fork in the creek, and for that kindness he'd asked nothing but a prayer for his wife back in Illinois. Lizzie owed the world 1,000 such prayers, and had none to spend but the quick sort you kept in your pocket. Lord, just the next mile. Lord, the next door. She paused at the dressmaker's blue calico in the window, neat as a hymn, then moved. On. A drunk laughed big and went out of the saloon door. She skirted the mud and the eyes and came at last to the livery. The big sliding door stood half open. Inside it was dim and warm and smelled of a better life. Clean horse, oiled tack. "Honest work? Help you?" a voice said, deep and even. He stood in the shadow beside a black gelding, one broad hand smoothing the animal's neck, hat brimmed down against the light, shirt sleeves rolled, forearms roped with the sort of muscle you got by lifting the world one bale, one fence post, one day at a time. He wore money and didn't bother to show it plain gear. Good leather, a revolver that looked like it had been used when it needed using, and not one time more. Lizzie could tell the difference. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Any kind. I can muck, curry, mend harness, sweep a floor cleaner in Sunday. I won't take charity." He studied her. Not the way men in saloons studied a woman, but like a rancher looks at a sky that might be weather. His eyes were a clear, tired green. "What's your name?" "Elizabeth O'Rourke. Folks call me Lizzie." He touched the horse's cheekbone with his knuckles, thoughtful. "James Calder," he said at last. "Most say Calder or Jim." She knew that name. Anybody within 2 days' ride knew it. The Double Bar Sea ran 30,000 acres of deed and twice that in open range. Its cattle grazed from the Sage up to the Pine Line. James Calder had money, a quiet temper, and a sorrow people spoke of with the respect a man's grief is due. They said he'd buried a wife and a newborn in one week 2 winters ago, and hadn't. Laughed out loud since. They also said he seldom came to town and never brought trouble with him. "Mr. Calder," Lizzie said, folding her hands so he wouldn't see the way they shook. "I'll work for a place in the hay tonight, and a plate if you've got one spare. After that, day to day till you're tired of me." The wind clattered the saloon sign again, and from the street came the sudden whip of a man's voice, sharp as a quirt. Calder's eyes flicked sideways, past Lizzie's shoulder. He didn't move, but something in him did a stillness that was more readiness than calm. "You got people?" he asked. "I had a husband," she said, and the words came out like a stone hitting water, one soft sound, and then the rings of it going out and out. "He died beneath earth. He never should have been under. I got nobody now, but what the Lord keeps an eye on when he can spare it." Calder nodded once, as if that accounted tallied. "You can sweep the feed room, then see if you still like the idea." He turned to the stable boy, who'd appeared as quiet as a colt. "Ben, show Miss O'Rourke the broom, and where not to step." Ben's grin was missing one tooth front and center. "This way, ma'am." Work was a relief, even work that raised dust enough to choke a churchyard. The broom handle fit her hand like something remembered. Her shoulders burned in the good, honest way, and by the time she'd stacked feed sacks straight and found the floor under a season of spilled oats, her breath came steady and the tremble had gone out of her fingers. Ben, who talked like the creek ran through him, said Mr. Calder came down himself when the bay threw a shoe or the freight team needed settling. Said the ranch hands called him boss when they had to and Jim when they forgot, and he never made a man regret either. Said after Mrs. Calder died, he slept out at the North Line camp for near a month, alone in the snow that would shave your lungs. He don't show it much, Ben said, sweeping in the doorway and watching her not watching him, but it sits on him. What does? Lizzie asked, though she knew, missing him. When the dinner bell clanged for the hands enamel basin, thick stew, coffee black as a coal seam Calder, set a tin plate in front of Lizzie, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Eat," he said, not as an order, but as a fact. That would not be argued. She did, and the first spoonful made her dizzy with gratitude. She just wiped her bowl clean with a heel of bread, when the livery door rasped open hard, and a man came in on a swaggering draught of cheap whiskey and newer money. He wore a silk vest puffed with self-importance, and a gun hung low like he wanted strangers to admire it. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," he said, taking in the scene like it had been arranged for him. "There she is. Told you I'd find you, Liz." Her body answered before her mind did, shoulders hitching a little, chin coming up too quick. She put the spoon down quiet. "Afternoon, Mr. Crowley," Calder said, voice level. "What business you got in my barn?" The man gave a theatrical start. "Why, I do beg your pardon, Jim. Didn't see you in the shadow there." He tipped his hat without lowering his head. "You know me, Silas Crowley, agent for the Consolidated Bank of Cheyenne, also broker of what's the word? Opportunities." "Opportunities," Calder repeated as if testing the metal of it. Miss O'Rourke availed herself of a small advance back in Laramie. Crowley fished a paper from his vest, held it like a preacher with a scripture. "Our terms are generous, but naturally we must protect our investment. I'll take charge of her employ. See she remits a portion of her wages directly to the bank. Keep her from wandering." His smile showed the thin edge of a toothpick. "Wandering women are such a loss to the territory." Lizzie heard the blood in her ears. She'd put her mark on a paper she couldn't read when the road and the hunger had been longer than her sense. $3 had felt like rescue. She should have known rescue that quick wanted its payment with interest she didn't have. "Miss O'Rourke works where she pleases," Calder said. "And she's on my time this hour." Crowley's eyes slid to Lizzie, back to Calder. "You'll find the writ's binding. Sheriff will back it. I'll hear that from him." Calder didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Meanwhile, you'll put your paper away and try the cafe for coffee. You need sobering." Crowley's jaw flexed. "I'll try your patience if you push me," he said in a lower tone. You're a man of means, Jim no call to borrow trouble off a stray. I'm speaking as a friend. You don't have a voice that fits that word, Calder said, and that was the first cold thing he'd said all day. The stable went still. Even the black gelding flicked an ear and steadied. Crowley measured the distance between the three of them and found none. Of it liked him. He smoothed his vest with hands that wanted something to do. This isn't over, he said lightly, as if he were the kind of man who left things half-finished on purpose. He tucked the paper back into his vest and walked out into the white-boned glare of afternoon. Calder stood a long moment looking at the door as if the wind itself had grown teeth. "Ben," he said, without turning his head, "take the bay and circle round back to the marshal's. Ask if he's at his desk. If he ain't, ask where he is. Don't chatter." Ben was gone like a wren. Calder set the coffee pot back on the little iron stove and poured a half-cup for Lizzie. His hand was steady. When he passed it to her, his eyes were too. "You can finish the feed-room or sit a spell," he said. "Either way, you're under my roof till I say different." "I can't pay you," Lizzie said, and hated the way it sounded like weakness dressed up as decency. "I didn't ask your pocket to talk." The corner of his mouth moved in the ghost of almost humor. "Besides, there's pay in a barn. Swept proper." She stared at the steam off the coffee, breathing it like medicine. "You've no reason to carry my trouble." "True," he said. "I got trouble enough. Most men do. But I got more room than most." He lifted his chin toward the door. "Crowley's a flea that comes with the dog of this town. He jumps, I scratch." Something in her loosened just a notch, just enough to let air in. The livery felt warmer, the coffee hotter. "Where do you live, Mr. Calder?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "South Fork," he said. "Yellow Creek line." Big house looked smaller than it felt when it was full. The tired green of his eyes went farther away and came back. "You'll bed down in the loft tonight, if you like. I'll see you're fed. Tomorrow we'll speak to the marshal proper, and I'll put a word in at the mercantile. They can always use hands that know a needle." She opened her mouth to say she'd sleep in the hay, that she'd lean against a stall with her shawl pulled tight and no bother to anyone. The old words came up out of habit. "I'll sleep in the awe. You'll sleep under a roof meant for it," he said, gentle. As a hand on a skittish colt, "There's a cot in the tack room. Door latches from the inside. You'll take it." She swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Jim is enough," he said, and picked up a rasp to tend a shoe as if he hadn't just stepped between her and a trap with a bank's name on it, the afternoon thin to winter light. Ben came pounding back with an answer marshal out. At a boundary dispute, due in by dusk, Calder nodded once. He saw her to the mercantile for needles and thread, deducted from tomorrow's wage, and stood by while she chose a bar of lye soap like it was jewelry. People stepped quick to make room for him, but minded their eyes. Money moved in that quiet. Back at the livery, he hung a lantern high and steady. "What put sorrow on you, Mr. Calder?" Lizzie asked before she could stop it. The question slipped out in the same way confession does, because silence weighs too much. "A wife and a son," he said simply, "and a doctor who'd seen more than he knew." "I'm sorry," she whispered, because there were only 2 words out here that fit such losses, and that was one of them. He nodded like a man accepting weather. "You came far." "A river's worth and a handful of names," she said. "I'm still learning which to keep." "Keep your own," he said. "It's honest." Dusk came on like a curtain lowering. The marshal didn't word was he'd bedded down out at the Wilson claim to keep 2 old men from shooting at fence posts and calling it law. Calder fed the black, checked the latch on the little tack-room door, and set a tin cup of water and a folded blanket on the narrow cot. Crowley's boots came back just past dark, Lizzie heard them first. A slow, smug rhythm, spurs talking to each. Other like men in a back booth. Calder heard them too. He put one finger to his lips, not for her, but for the horses, then moved to the door, every step quiet as a cat on new snow. "Jim!" Crowley's voice oiled in from the street. "Brought a friend of mine to talk sense." Another voice followed, thinner, official. "Evening, Calder. Deputy Haskins. I'll need the woman turned over to my custody till the marshal can rule on this writ." "Marshal's out," Calder said through the plank door. "And you ain't him. Deputy's good enough." Paper crackled. "You keepin' her? Here's a kind of harborin'." Calder opened the door on its leather hinge and stood in the rectangle of lamplight. The deputy, nervous, narrow-shouldered, a strap of mustache like something he'd borrowed, shifted his footing. Crowley smiled that thin, tired smile. "Evenin', deputy," Calder said pleasantly. "You serving papers you read, or just papers you're handed by men with shiny vests?" "I can read," Haskins muttered. "Says right here, let me save you the trouble." Calder's voice stayed mild, the kind that let a man keep his pride while it took his gun. "That's a promissory drawn on a bank in Cheyenne without a witnessing officer. Miss O'Rourke signed with a mark. If there's coercion, and there is when a woman's hungry and a man's slick, it won't hold in Judge Carter's court. You know it, and so does Crowley." Crowley off the laugh. "You mackin' law, Jim?" "Just remembering it." Calder steadied his hat by its brim. "Haskins, you walk back to your office and leave your badge on the nail till the marshal returns. Crowley, you can stand here freezing, or you can go oil whatever machine pays you." The deputy's eyes flickered to the lantern, to Crowley, to Calder's hand, near nothing at all. He wasn't a bad man, just a small one hoping to be larger than his coat. "I'll wait on the marshal," he decided, backing 2 steps before. He turned. Crowley held his ground half a breath longer. "You're putting your brand on trouble that ain't yours." Calder's answer was quiet enough Lizzie felt it more than heard it. "Trouble's every man's when it comes hunting. The weak." Crowley's smile finally cracked. "I'll be back with Carter himself," he snapped. "We'll test your principles on the bench." "Good," Calder said. "We could use the exercise." They left. The wind came in behind them and found no purchase. Calder shut the door and set the bar. He didn't look at Lizzie for a long moment. He stood with his palm on the wood as if feeling for tremor. When he did turn, he managed another of those almost smiles, the kind that didn't ask her to smile back. "You'll take the cot," he said. "Lantern stays lit low. If you need water, there's the cup. If you need me, say my name." She tried again, softer this time, the words worn from the road but different in his light. "I can sleep in the hay." He shook his head once. "Not while you're under my say." She stared at the rough cot, at the neat folded blanket, at the surety in his voice like a fence post said true. The livery creaked its old bones. The horses shifted and settled. And somewhere out in the town, a piano pulled a drunk tune half a mile long. Her hands finally stopped their small, frightened trembling. "Thank you." "Jim," she said. He tipped. His hat, the gesture devoid of flourish, full of something else. "Daylight's a better talker," he said. "We'll hear what it has to say." She lay down on the narrow cot and listened to wind and wood and the quiet movements of a man who carried sorrow carefully and had room, left somehow for other people's. She slept because the door latched from the inside and because just beyond, someone had said he would stand. Out on Main Street, Silas Crowley walked fast through the cold, his vest too thin for the pride it was stitched with. Windows along the street glowed against the dark like stubborn little hearts. He didn't see the tall shape on the hotel balcony step back into deeper shadow to watch him pass, nor hear the soft scrape of a chair as that watcher sat down again. Thoughtful morning would bring the marshal, and the talk and papers held up to real light. Morning would bring more questions about debts and men, and what a lonely cattleman thought he was doing taking in a woman with a Missouri voice and ruin in her pockets. But for now, the lantern burned steady in the tack room of the Double Bar. Seastown barn, and the wind clean, unpitying, honest as winter ran the length of Sagebrush Crossing and went on, lifting the smell of sage and snow toward the mountains. Morning came hard and bright, the kind that made every nail and window pane gleam with cold truth. Elizabeth O'Rourke Lizzie, to those who had once known her before, sorrow, pared her down woke with her back stiff from the narrow cot in the chee. Tack room. The lantern had burned low through the night, its last glow flickering against the wooden wall like a heartbeat she hadn't dared trust. She sat up, pulled her shawl tight, and listened to the world outside the barn. Hooves shifted. A harness jingled. And somewhere in the yard beyond, James Calder's low voice carried to the geldings like he was talking to old friends. He was already at work, and the sound of it steadied her in a way she didn't expect. Lizzie washed her face in a tin basin, combed her hair with her fingers, and whispered a brief prayer, half apology, half plea. When she stepped into the light, she found Calder pouring oats into a trough, the early sun gilding his broad shoulders and catching in the stubble along his jaw. He looked like a man carved out of the same mountains that towered blue against the horizon. "Morning," he said simply, without turning. "Morning," she echoed. He glanced at her then, those green eyes catching hers with a kind of honesty that made it hard to look too long. "Coffee's on the stove in the corner. Won't win ribbons, but it'll hold you steady." Lizzie followed the smell and poured herself half a cup, hands tight around the tin to keep them from shaking. Warmth seeped through, easing the night's chill from her bones. She drank and dared to ask the question that had needled her since the day before. "Why'd you do it?" He looked up from cinching a saddle. "Do what?" "Step in. Stop Crowley." Most men would have looked the other way. Calder's jaw shifted, working over words like stones. "Because I've seen what happens when nobody does." His voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the creak of leather. "Doesn't sit right with me." The simple answer carried more weight than a sermon. Lizzie nodded, her throat tight. She understood men who looked away. She'd known plenty. They rode out later, Calder astride his black gelding, Lizzie perched in the wagon seat while Ben, the stable boy, took the reins. Calder wanted to check the north line before the marshal returned, and he'd said plainly that she'd be safer under his eye than left alone. The land unfurled, around them sagebrush plains rolling into low hills, cottonwoods clutching me, banks of a narrow creek, and the far-off bighorns rising like guardians carved from the sky. But beauty here was never soft. The wind scraped its skin, and hawks wheeled overhead, circling for something smaller, weaker. Lizzie pulled her shawl tighter, and thought of Missouri, of green fields that seemed endless and kind, of a husband with dirt under his nails and hope in his eyes. Samuel O'Rourke had been all promise when he'd spoken of the mines. "One strike and we'll be set, Lizzie," he'd said, eyes shining with a dream she hadn't had the heart to dim. But the mine had collapsed before it paid a dime, and Samuel had been buried under rock and ambition alike. She'd buried a stillborn son the winter before that, and with Samuel gone, there'd been nothing but debts and hungry creditors who looked at her like crows at a carcass. Crowley wasn't the first man to see her desperation as opportunity. Only the latest dot the memory made her grip the shawl until her knuckles whitened. She didn't notice Calder watching her from the corner of his eye. "You came far," he said after a while. "Further than I thought I could." He nodded once. "Running from or running to?" "Both," she admitted. "Running from debts I couldn't pay, and hands I couldn't stop. Running toward, well, I don't rightly know. Just away. Calder was silent for a long time, the creak of the saddle leather filling the space. Then he said, "A woman shouldn't have to live like that." Lizzie gave a dry laugh. "Out here, a woman lives however she can." Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow darker than his words. She realized then that his sorrow wasn't just something spoken of in town whispers. It lived close under his skin, as real as the revolver at his hip. They crested a hill and came upon the north line fence, several posts sagging where a storm had blown through weeks back. Calder swung down, pulled tools from the wagon, and set to work like a man who didn't know any other way but forward. Lizzie watched him tamp the soil, shoulders flexing with each strike of the post maul. Work was his language, she thought. Work and silence. Ben busied himself tying wire, but Lizzie's gaze kept drifting to Calder, the way his hat brim shaded, eyes that seemed older than his years, the quiet patience in his movements, the sadness, yes, but also the steadiness, a steadiness she'd been starved for. When he straightened, wiping sweat with the back of his wrist, their eyes met. And for just a second, the Wyoming wind fell quiet. By dusk, they were back in town. The marshal returned and waiting in his office. Marshal Tomlin was a broad man with kind eyes and a voice like gravel dragged down a dry creek bed. He listened as Calder explained Crowley's writ, then examined the paper with a practiced squint. "Forged. Sure as my name's Tomlin," he said. "No court would touch this. Crowley's been sniffing around widows and greenhorns since he blew in from Cheyenne. You did right standing her ground, Jim." He stamped the paper with a red mark and tossed it into the stove, where it curled and blackened. "That's the end of it here. But watch yourself, Miss O'Rourke. Men like Crowley don't take kindly to losing." Lizzie's hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. Relief battled with fear. "Thank you, Marshal." Calder touched his hat brim. "Much obliged." As they stepped back into the evening, the sun sank in a blaze of gold and fire, casting long shadows across the dusty street. The townsfolk watched from porches and windows, their eyes curious, some sympathetic, some suspicious. A widow alone was always a subject for gossip. A widow in the company of James Calder was twice, so Lizzie felt the weight of it. Calder didn't seem to notice, or else he didn't care. "Your choice," he said, quiet enough only she could hear. "You want to keep out alone? I'll see you get started right. You want work and a roof? You'll find both at my place. I need someone too. Keep the house, and—" He hesitated, as if the words cost him. "It might do me some good, having company." Lizzie stared at him, the dying light painting his face in bronze and shadow. She thought of the cot in the tack room, the hunger in her belly, the memory of Crowley's grip on her arm. She thought of her husband's grave back in Missouri, marked by nothing but a cairn of stones. "You don't know me," she said softly. "I know enough," Calder answered. "I know you're tired and you're not beaten. That's all I need." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke, and Lizzie felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but the shape of it, waiting. She nodded once. James Calder was a man who lived by the rhythm of dawn and dusk, and Elizabeth O'Rourke soon learned that the silence between those hours carried more weight than words. She and the children, Thomas with his stubborn jaw, Emma with her wide, searching eyes, had been on his land for less than a week, yet she felt the measure of her life begin to shift. Calder had set her and the children in the main house, a sturdy log structure with a low roof and a hearth large enough to hold back. Wyoming's night chill. He'd made it clear. You'll keep house, tend what needs tending. That's wages enough. I'll see to the stock. But Lizzie soon realized he did more than see to the stock. Every morning before the rooster crowed, he was out mending fences, cutting timber, or breaking a new horse. By the time she roused the children and set coffee on the stove, his shirt was already damp with sweat, his hat low against the rising sun. And though he spoke little, his eyes were watchful. At first, Lizzie thought it was suspicion. After all, who wouldn't doubt a woman who'd stumbled half-starved into town with 2 young ones in tow? But it wasn't suspicion, not exactly. It was something steadier, almost protective, as though he was taking her measure in the same way he would a horse or a stretch of open land, weighing its strength, testing its boundaries. The children settled. Quickly, children always did when offered even a scrap of safety. Emma discovered the creek that wound behind the cabin, spending hours making little flotillas of bark and leaves. Thomas shadowed Calder whenever he could, following him with wide eyes and a boy's hunger to learn how to swing an axe or coil. A rope. Calder never invited him along outright, but neither did he send the boy away. And Lizzie noticed, with something sharp in her chest, the way Calder adjusted his stride so Thomas could keep up. She, too, began to breathe differently. Her hands, long accustomed to scrubbing floors in boarding houses, found a rhythm in kneading bread, stitching warm trousers, polishing the cabin windows until they caught the sun. Each task, simple as it was, reminded her that this was no longer a cot in a tack room or a church stoop where charity came begrudgingly, if at all. It was though she scarcely dared name it a place to belong. Still, shadows stretched longer at dusk. Crowley had been quiet since the marshal burned his forged writ, but Lizzie knew the type of man he was. Men like him did not vanish. They lingered, biding their time like snakes in tall grass. That truth came home one afternoon when Lizzie took Emma to town for flour and salt pork. Calder had remained behind with Thomas to mend the corral rails. Lizzie borrowed the wagon and promised she'd be back before sundown. The day was bright and sharp, the air carrying the scent of pine. Emma sat high on the seat, swinging her legs, her little braid bouncing with each jolt of the wheels. Lizzie forced herself to smile for her daughter's sake, but her eyes swept the street of Sagebrush Crossing with caution as she pulled the teen to a stop outside the general store. The store smelled of flour and kerosene, familiar enough to ease her nerves for a moment. She bartered carefully one apron she'd sewn by hand in exchange for extra sugar, flour, and a twist of coffee. When she stepped outside, Emma clutched a peppermint stick in one fist, her smile broad as the prairie. That was when she saw him. Crowley leaning against a post across the street, his hat low, a toothpick between his teeth, eyes fixed on her with the oily patience of a man who thought time favored him. Lizzie's throat went dry. She gripped Emma's hand so tightly the girl yelped. "Mama?" "Stay close," Lizzie whispered, pushing her toward the wagon. Crowley tipped his hat, all false politeness. "Afternoon, Mrs. O'Rourke. Didn't figure you'd be lingering here long. Man might think you found yourself a protector." Lizzie ignored him, setting Emma on the seat and clambering up beside her. Her fingers fumbled with the reins. Crowley's voice followed, smooth as a snake's glide. "Men, Mike. Calder burn out, ma'am. You and them young uns'll be mine to deal with soon enough. Can't hide behind another man's shadow forever." Her stomach churned, but she snapped the reins anyway, urging the horses forward, refusing to look back. She didn't have to, because Calder was already there. She saw him as the wagon rounded the last bend toward home, sitting tall in the saddle at the edge of the trail. Eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. She hadn't expected him, hadn't told him, but something in him must have known. "You were late," he said, voice. Even though his gaze searched her face, there was trouble, Lizzie admitted, her throat tight. He was there, watching, Calder's jaw set like granite. "Crowley?" She nodded. His gaze flicked to Emma, who sat clutching her peppermint, wide-eyed but quiet. Calder dismounted and handed Lizzie the reins. His hand brushed hers, rough and calloused, grounding her more than words could. "Next time," he said, low and steady, "you don't go to town alone. Not until this is settled." "I can't have you minding me like a child," Lizzie shot back, surprising herself with the heat in her voice. Calder didn't flinch. Not a child. A woman with 2 young uns who deserves better than to be. Cornered by the likes of him, the words struck deep. She turned away, blinking hard against sudden tears. Emma broke the silence first, her voice small but fierce. "Mama, he won't get us, will he? Mr. Calder won't let him." Lizzie gathered her daughter close, her eyes meeting Calder's over the top of Emma's head. And for the first time, she didn't see just sorrow in him. She saw a vow, unspoken but iron strong. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Lizzie sat by the fire darning socks with shaking hands. Calder entered, his shirt damp from washing, hair tousled, eyes fixed on the flames rather than her. "You don't owe us this," she whispered. His gaze lifted, steady and quiet. "Don't I? Maybe I've been owing something for a long time. Maybe this is it." The fire cracked between them, sending sparks up the chimney, and Lizzie felt the room hold its breath. For a moment, the world outside, the debts, the threats, the sorrow fell away, and in the silence she realized she was no longer merely a woman running. She was a woman being seen. The wind carried a smell of wood smoke and frost that morning, sharp enough to cut through Lizzie's shawl. She stood on the porch, wringing her hands on a rag, watching James Calder saddle his bay gelding. He had said nothing of last night's admission. Maybe I've been owing something for a long time. Maybe this is it. But she had not slept, replaying the weight of his words, the quiet certainty in his eyes. The children were inside, Emma humming over her rag doll, Thomas practicing letters with a stick of charcoal on scrap paper. For the first time since Samuel's death, Lizzie felt something almost like safety, though it balanced precariously like glass set on a shaky table. Calder pulled the cinch tight, his movements spare and deliberate. "I'll ride out to the north pasture. Won't be long. You think he'll come?" she asked, her voice low. Calder's gaze flicked to her, hard as flint. "Crowley's the kind who don't forget a wound to his pride. He'll come. Question is when and how many men he'll bring." She swallowed. "Then shouldn't we run? Pack what we can and keep ahead of him?" "No," Calder said simply. He tugged the reins, swung into the saddle, and looked down at her. "Running's what he counts on. You keep running, he'll keep hunting. Sooner or later, he'll catch you. And if we stay," he touched the brim of his hat, "then he's got to catch me first." Crowley arrived 2 days later. The town of Sagebrush Crossing was never lively, but that morning it was uneasy, like the hush before a storm. Lizzie had taken Thomas and Emma into town for church, against her better judgment, but Calder insisted they needed to show themselves, to prove they weren't skulking like fugitives. The church sat at the end of Main Street, its crooked steeple, reaching for a sky heavy with gray. Lizzie bowed her head as Reverend Halloway droned on about Job's trials. Her hands clasped around Emma's small fingers. But her mind was elsewhere, on Crowley, on debts, on forged papers and whispered threats. She got her answer before the final hymn. The church doors burst open, and cold light spilled in with the creak of boots. "Morning, folks," came a voice, slick as oil. Lizzie's head snapped up. Crowley stood framed in the doorway, his hat tipped low, a cruel smile riding his mouth. He looked out over the congregation like a man surveying his own holdings. 4 riders fanned behind him, their eyes flat, their hands never far from their gun belts. Reverend Halloway faltered mid-verse, his thin voice dying away. No one spoke. No one dared. Crowley's eyes found Lizzie across the pews. He tipped his hat mockingly. "Well now, Mrs. O'Rourke, I was wondering when I'd lay eyes on you again." Emma whimpered and clutched Lizzie's arm. Thomas, bless his small, foolish courage, shoved himself in front of his mother like a shield. "Stay down," Lizzie whispered, heart thundering. Crowley stepped into the aisle, his spurs clicking on the worn floorboards. "You been hiding out here long enough. Papers say your late husband left me what's owed, and I'm here to collect." He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, waving it like scripture. "Signed and sealed, debt and heirs both. Ain't no runnin' from law." "That's no law." Calder's voice cut through the hush. Every head turned. He stood at the back of the church, framed by light from the open doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the wind. His hat shadowed his eyes, but the line of his jaw was pure iron. His right hand hung close to his holster, easy and loose. "Law don't come written in your hand, Crowley," Calder said. "And these folks know it." A murmur rippled through the pews, townsfolk shifting uneasily. The marshal was away in Cheyenne, and Sheriff Riggins had a habit of turning up missing whenever real trouble came. All eyes settled on the two men. Now the quiet rancher and the swaggering creditor. Crowley's smile widened, though his eyes glittered. "Well, if it ain't James Calder. Didn't figure you'd step into another man's quarrel. Thought you'd had enough burying folks after what happened at Dead Horse Creek." The jab landed like a blow. Lizzie saw Calder stiffen, his jaw tightening. She didn't know what Dead Horse Creek meant, but the name dropped like lead in the us. Calder took one step forward, his voice low but carrying. "My quarrel's wherever men like you prey on the weak. You lay a hand on her or them children, you'll answer to me." Crowley's laugh was sharp. "You think standing in a church makes you righteous, Calder? You're just one man. I've got four." Calder's hand brushed his holster. "And best hope your four shoot straighter than you talk." The standoff stretched taut, the whole church holding its breath. Lizzie's heart hammered so loud she thought it might echo off the rafters. She could taste fear in her mouth, bitter, as Thomas clung to her arm. "Mama," he whispered, "he won't win, will he?" She squeezed his hand, forcing a steadiness she didn't feel. "Not while Mr. Calder stands." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the church windows. Lizzie knew the storm had finally broken. The pews creaked as townsfolk leaned forward, every soul in the church caught in the grip of silence. Crowley stood grinning like a wolf, his forged paper fluttering in one hand, while his men shifted uneasily behind him. At the other end of the aisle, James Calder didn't flinch. He looked like he had grown from the ground, itself rooted, unyielding. Lizzie could hardly breathe. Emma clung to her skirt, eyes wide, while Thomas held his stick of charcoal like a weapon, as though bravery alone might fend off the danger. Calder's voice, when it came, was steady as a mountain stream. "You're wrong about one thing, Crowley. Lizzie O'Rourke isn't alone. She never was. She and her children are under my protection now. That's law enough for this town." A gasp rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Pritchard clutched. "Her pearls." Reverend Halloway muttered something about holy ground, and Crowley's grin twisted into something sharper, hungrier. "Your protection, eh?" Crowley sneered, stepping closer, boots ringing against the floorboards. "That what you call it? Everyone knows you're a broken man, Calder. A rancher who couldn't even protect his own blood. And now you aim to play the gallant knight for another man's widow? Why, what's she paying you with?" Lizzie's face burned hot, shame and fury rising together. She opened her mouth to speak, but Calder lifted a hand, quieting her without. Taking his eyes from the predator before him, "She pays me with nothing," Calder said evenly. "Because she owes me nothing." But if you aim to claim her as property, then you claim me too." He stepped forward into the aisle, his boots sounding like judgment. "And I don't come cheap." Crowley laughed, but the sound cracked. He hadn't expected this. "You think talking big will scare me? These papers say she belongs to me until the debt's paid. The law will back me." "The law?" Calder's tone hardened. "You mean Judge Brewster, the one you bought drinks for in Garrett County? He's got no jurisdiction here, and even if he did, no court west of the Mississippi recognizes claim over a woman like cattle." Calder paused, and in that pause Lizzie heard something shift, something deeper than defiance. "Unless," he continued, his voice carrying across the hushed pews, "she chooses to belong to me." Lizzie's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward him, her heart stuttering. Crowley barked a laugh, but Calder pressed on, his words ringing out so the whole town could hear. "Elizabeth O'Rourke, will you stand as my wife before God and these people? Not tomorrow, not some distant day. Here, now." The church erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few shocked exclamations. Reverend Holloway dropped his hymnal with a thud. Lizzie felt the room spin. She had expected Calder to defend her. Yes, but not this, never this. Her mind raced. What would it mean? Marriage would shield her and the children from Crowley's false claim. It would give them a name, a place, protection under law. But it would also bind her to this man, this rancher carved from silence and grief. Calder's eyes met hers. Behind the steel, there was no command, no coercion. Only a question, offered steady and plain. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "Yes." A murmur swept the church like wind through dry grass. Crowley's face flushed red with fury. "You think a sham wedding will stop me?" Reverend Holloway, flustered but not foolish, straightened. "It won't be sham if I marry them proper, and I'll do it gladly." He looked to Calder and Lizzie, his voice gaining strength. "The Lord commands we protect the widow and the orphan. I'll not stand idle when a false creditor seeks to enslave them." Calder stepped forward, offering Lizzie his arm. She rose on shaking legs, clutching Emma's hand, Thomas close by her side. The children looked up at her, hope shining through their fear. "And let's be done with it," Calder said. The hurried vows were spoken right there in the church aisle. Calder's voice never wavered, though his hands bore the marks of ranch work, calloused and rough, as they closed gently over Lizzie's trembling fingers. Lizzie's words came softer, but with every syllable her spine straightened, her voice gathering strength like a flame catching. "I do," she said at last, and the moment she did, the entire congregation seemed to breathe again. Reverend Holloway lifted his hand. "By God's word and by the law of this territory, I pronounce you man and wife." Crowley's roar of rage cut across the church. He tore the forged papers in half and flung them into the air like ash. "This ain't over, Calder. You can't hide behind holy words. You'll both pay for crossing me." His men shifted, uncertain. Some looked ashamed, others wary. Crowley stormed out into the glare of the afternoon sun, spurs jangling like a death knell. His riders followed, though not all with conviction. Inside the church, silence lingered. Then Emma tugged at Lizzie's sleeve. "Mama," she whispered, "does this mean we really have a home now?" Lizzie knelt, drawing her close, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, sweetheart, we have a home." When she looked up, Calder's eyes met hers. For the first time, she thought she glimpsed not just sorrow, but something warmer flickering beneath the fragile beginnings of hope. The morning sun broke over the ridges like fire spilling across the prairie, but its warmth never reached the hearts of the townsfolk. News of what had happened in the church traveled faster than wildfire in a dry canyon. By nightfall, every saloon, boarding house, And back alley in Sagebrush Crossing buzzed with talk. Calder done married the widow O'Rourke right under Crowley's nose. Old Sheriff Watson muttered as he leaned on the hitching post outside his office. Might as well have signed his own death warrant. Crowley, humiliated before the town, wasn't a man to take shame lightly. By dawn the next day he was already riding south, gathering every gun hand and cutthroat willing to be bought with coin or whiskey. He whispered promises of gold, land, and lawless spoils. Within 2 days, he returned with a half-dozen hardened riders at his back, men with scarred faces, hungry eyes, and rifles that gleamed in the morning sun dot up at the ranch. Lizzie was mending Thomas's shirt by the fire when she heard the distant sound of horses. Her hands froze on the needle. Emma was playing with a rag doll Calder had repaired for her, humming softly. Thomas looked up sharply. "Mama, that's too many horses." Calder had heard it too. He was already on the porch, rifle in hand, his shoulders squared against the rising threat. Lizzie stepped out beside him, her heart pounding. Down the trail, dust rose in a dark cloud, sunlight flashing off metal. "They're coming," Calder said quietly, almost to himself. "Crowley's not content to bluff this time. He means to end it." Lizzie gripped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Can we stand against them?" "There are too many will stand," Calder said firmly. "Because this land is ours now, and no man is going to take it while I draw breath." That afternoon, Calder rode into town with Lizzie and the children at his side. They needed more than rifles. They needed voices. The church bell tolled, calling people into the square. Crowley stood waiting, his men fanned out like wolves behind him. His smile was pure venom. "Calder," he drawled, "you think that sham wedding makes her yours? Makes her get vanish?" He spat in the dust. "Marriage don't erase a contract." Lizzie's voice rose before Calder could answer. "What? Contract?" she demanded, stepping forward. Her voice was fierce, her cheeks flushed with courage. "The one you forged after my husband died? The one you waved like a whip in front of a whole church? Everyone saw it, Crowley. Everyone knows what you are." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Folks who'd once turned their eyes away from Lizzie now stood a little straighter, muttering their agreement. Crowley's grin faltered, but he recovered quickly, lifting a hand. "You call me a liar, woman? You think these good people will side with a widow and a broken rancher against me?" Calder stepped forward, his rifle slung across his back, his revolver heavy at his side. "No, Crowley. They'll side with thee. Truth. And the truth is, you're a thief who hides behind paper. I'll give you one chance. Leave town. Don't come back." The square held its breath. Crowley's face twisted with rage. "Boys," he snapped to his hired guns, "show 'em what happens when you spit in the face of a Crowley." The first shot cracked the air like thunder. Townsfolk scattered, diving for doorways. Horses screamed and bolted. Lizzie shoved Thomas and Emma behind the trough outside the general store, her own body shielding them. As bullets whined through the dust, Calder dropped to one knee, returning fire with calm precision. 2 of Crowley's men fell in the first volley. Another took cover behind a wagon, rifle spitting flame. The town erupted into chaos. Lizzie clutched her children close, praying silently. She could see Calder in the street, moving with the cold. Grace of a man who had lived too long with ghosts. Every shot he fired was measured, deliberate. But there were too many of them. Crowley himself stood back, barking orders, revolver flashing as he fired wild into the smoke. His men pressed forward, confident that numbers would drown courage. Then something unexpected happened. The townsfolk, long cowed by Crowley's power, began to stir. Josiah Pike from the general store appeared in his doorway with a shotgun. "I've had enough of this," he shouted, blasting one of Crowley's riders clean off his horse. Mrs. Hutchkins from the boarding house hurled boiling water from a kettle down onto another outlaw crouched below her porch. The man screamed, dropping his pistol. Even Reverend Holloway, voice shaking but determined, stood in the church doorway with a rifle older than he was. "This is the Lord's house," he thundered, "and I'll not see it turned into a den of murderers." Calder seized the moment. He strode into the middle of the square, revolver in hand, his voice carrying above the chaos. "Crowley, this ends with you and me. Face me, man to man, if you've got the spine, or crawl back into the shadows and admit to everyone here what kind of coward you are." The challenge froze the fight. Gun smoke drifted through the air, sunlight slanting through it like blades. Crowley's men glanced at one another, their confidence shaken. Slowly, eyes turned toward their leader. Crowley snarled, but his pride left him no choice. He stepped forward into the open street. "You want it that way, Calder? Fine. But when? I drop you. Your whore and her brats will be mine all the same." Calder's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His revolver hung loose at his side, his green eyes steady. The crowd pulled back, forming a wide circle of silence and dust. Lizzie rose from behind the trough, trembling, but her voice carried across the square. "James." He glanced at her. Just once. Her face was pale but fierce, her eyes shining. That single look seemed to root him deeper. To steady his hand, two men stood facing each other in the dying light, one with greed burning in his heart, the other with loss behind him, and love before him. The town of Sagebrush Crossing waited. The next heartbeat would decide everything. The air in the square hung heavy, thick with gun smoke and silence. The dust kicked up by panicked horses still floated in lazy swirls, catching the late sun and turning the space between the two men into a shimmering battlefield. James Calder stood calm and ready, his revolver low at his side. Every line of his body was taut with focus. Across from him, Luther Crowley shifted restlessly, his lips twisted into a sneer, but his eyes betraying the quiver of a man whose pride demanded a fight. He wasn't sure he could win. No one in the crowd spoke. The church bell gave a hollow clang. In the wind, the only sound besides the creak of saddle leather and the distant whinny of unsettled horses. Even Lizzie, holding Thomas and Emma tight behind the water trough, could barely breathe. "Draw," Calder said softly, the word carrying across the square like the strike of a match. Crowley's hand jerked toward his holster, but Calder was already moving. His revolver cleared leather in a smooth arc, years of cattle drives and border skirmishes guiding his hand as naturally as breathing. Two shots cracked in quick succession, blending into a single THUNDERCLAP. Crowley staggered backward, clutching his gun hand. His pistol clattered to the dirt, spinning once before coming to rest. Blood seeped between his fingers. The square exhaled as one. The fight should have ended there. But pride is a poison, and Crowley was drowning in it. With a guttural roar, he lunged for the fallen pistol with his left hand. Calder fired again. The bullet struck Crowley's boot heel, pinning the man to the dust without killing him. "Stay down," Calder ordered, his voice steady, but Crowley didn't know how. He clawed at the ground, fury painting his face red, spitting curses about debts and widows and property. Then Lizzie stepped into the open. Her shawl fluttered in the breeze, her hands trembling, but her voice clear. "That's enough, Crowley," she cried. "You call yourself a man, but all you've done is prey on the weak. My husband's debt was never yours to twist, and my children will never belong to you." Crowley froze, his wild eyes fixing on her. "You think this town will side with you? With a woman who—" "They already have," Calder interrupted, his revolver still aimed steady, and indeed, The crowd stirred. Josiah Pike's shotgun remained leveled. Mrs. Hutchkins stood with a kitchen cleaver in her fist. Reverend Holloway held his rifle across his chest like a shepherd's staff. One by one, the townsfolk who had once turned Lizzie away stood straighter, eyes hard. For the first time, Crowley looked around and realized he was alone. "You think you can shame me? Here?" He spat, blood dripping from his hand. "I'll come back. With papers. With more men. You can't stop me." "You're wrong," Calder said. He lowered his revolver just slightly, enough to show he didn't need to hide behind the barrel. "This ends here? Today? The law may be slow, but it's coming for you. And if it doesn't, this town will make sure you never darken its doors again." Murmurs of assent rolled through the square. Crowley's bravado cracked. He staggered upright, half dragging his boot where the bullet had torn through. His eyes darted to the crowd, but no allies came forward. Even his hired riders melted away. Into the alleys, unwilling to fight a losing battle. "You'll regret this," he hissed one last time. But when he mounted his horse, blood dripping from the saddle, no one moved to stop him. He rode out alone, the sun setting behind him, his shadow long and broken across the dust. Silence lingered after he was gone. The kind of silence that follows a storm when no one dares believe the sky is truly clear. Then Reverend Holloway lifted his rifle and said, "It's over." Relief rippled through the crowd. Folks who had hidden stepped forward. Mothers clutched their children. Old men shook Calder's hand. Lizzie's knees buckled, but Calder was there, steadying her with an arm around her shoulders. "You're safe," he murmured. She looked up at him, eyes shining with tears and pride. "No, James, we're safe." That night, the town gathered at Calder's ranch. Food was shared, songs were sung, and laughter replaced fear. Thomas and Emma played with the other children by the fire, their shadows dancing across the barn wall. Lizzie stood on the porch, watching them, her heart swelling. Calder joined her, his arm brushing hers in quiet solidarity. "You faced him down," she whispered. "You gave me back my life." Calder shook his head. "We faced him, together. Spoke when it mattered most, Lizzie. You showed this town that Crowley's power was nothing but fear." Their eyes met in the soft glow of the lantern. For the first time since Samuel's death, Lizzie felt the weight of widowhood lifting, replaced by something warmer, stronger. Hope in the distance. The wolves howled against the Wyoming night. But inside the circle of firelight, the Sullivan family and the rancher who had claimed them as his own stood unbroken. Tomorrow, there would be rebuilding. Tomorrow, the law would come. But tonight, they had one dot, and in Lizzie's heart, the embers of something deeper than gratitude began to glow. The morning after the dust had settled, the town of Willow Creek seemed almost reborn. News traveled fast on the prairie, faster than the telegraph lines sometimes. Within a day, everyone knew that Luther Crowley lay dead in the street, his schemes undone, his reputation shattered by the truth James Calder had dragged out into the open. The people of the town, who had once turned their faces away from Lizzie Sullivan and her two children, now seemed to look upon her with new eyes. Women brought food to the cabin, unsolicited but welcome. Warm loaves, jars of preserves, a sack of flour left on the porch with no note. Men who had stood silent when Bartlett's gang closed in on her that first night now tipped their hats. With respect. Hypocrisy, perhaps, but Lizzie felt no bitterness. For her children's sake, she accepted the change with grace. At the ranch, life found a rhythm that had never been possible in the long months of fear and flight. The house no longer felt hollow. With Lizzie's hands, the floors shone curtains, fluttered in the windows, and flowers bloomed again in the boxes Clara Calder had once planted. The laughter of children rang through the yard, Chasing ghosts back into memory. James Calder, though, seemed quieter than ever in the days that followed. He went about his chores with a steady hand and his usual patience, but something weighed on him. Lizzie saw it in the way he lingered on the porch at sunset, green eyes scanning the horizon as if still waiting for the next threat to come riding out of the distance. One evening, as the children slept soundly in their bed, Lizzie found him sitting on the porch rail, whittling at a piece of pine with his hunting knife. The sky was painted in streaks of fire and rose, the wind carrying the cool bite of approaching winter. She stepped outside, pulling her shawl close. "You're restless," she said softly. James looked up, startled out of his reverie. He gave her the ghost of a smile. "Maybe so. Habit's hard to shake. A man spends enough years waiting for trouble. He forgets how to sit easy when it's gone." Lizzie eased herself onto the rail beside him. For a long moment they watched the sky together in silence. Then she spoke, voice gentle but firm. "James, it's not gone for me either. Crowley's dead, but fear has a way of clinging. I've been running for so long. I don't know what it feels like to stop. But the children, they need this peace. They need roots." His hand stilled on the knife. He glanced at her, eyes shadowed. With something deeper than doubt, a man wrestling with himself. "They deserve more than roots," he said finally. "They deserve a home that no one can take from them. A name they can hold to. A father who'll stand in the doorway when the world comes calling." The words hung between them, heavier than any silence. Lizzie felt her heart pound. She turned to face him fully, her voice unsteady. "And what of their mother? Does she deserve someone to stand for her too?" James's eyes softened, a rare vulnerability breaking through his guarded exterior. He reached out, rough fingers brushing against hers, hesitant at first and then holding firm. "Lizzie Sullivan," he said, voice low and steady, "you've carried a burden no woman should ever have had to carry alone. You've walked through hunger, cold, and fear with more courage than most men I've known. And in all that time, you never once bent your pride. You're the strongest soul I've met. But you shouldn't have to be strong alone anymore." Her throat tightened, tears springing unbidden. "What are you saying, James?" He set the knife aside, pocketed the whittled scrap, and turned fully toward her. In the fading light, the rugged lines of his face seemed carved by the land itself, strong, enduring, marked by sorrow, but also by resilience. "I'm saying that I've come to care for you, for Thomas, for Emma, more than I ever thought my heart could manage after. Losing Clara and Amy, for a long time I believed there wasn't anything left of me to give. But you've shown me otherwise." He took a deep breath, his voice trembling despite the steadiness of his gaze. "I want you here, not as a guest, not as someone I hired to keep house. As my wife, as part of this ranch, as part of me." Lizzie's hand covered her mouth. The words struck her with the force of a thunderclap. For months she had braced herself against the world, against loneliness, against fear. Now here was this man, this steady, wounded, kind man, offering her the very thing she had convinced herself she would never find again. Belonging. She faltered, tears streaking her cheeks. "I don't know what to say." "Say, yes," James whispered, his hand tightening around hers. "Say yes, and let me carry the weight with you." For a long, breathless moment, the only sound was the rustling prairie grass, the call of a night bird in the distance. Lizzie searched his face, and what she found there, honesty, sorrow, hope, left her no room for doubt. "Yes," she said finally, the word breaking free on a sob. "Yes, James Calder, I'll marry you." Relief swept across his face, raw and unguarded, and before she could say another word, he pulled her into his arms. His kiss was tender, reverent, filled with all the promises he didn't know how to voice. She clung to him, feeling for the first time in years not like a widow or a fugitive, but like a woman cherished. When they drew apart, both laughing through their tears, Lizzie saw two small figures in the doorway. Thomas and Emma, roused by the fall. Voices peered out wide-eyed. "Mama," Emma whispered. "Are you crying?" Lizzie knelt and opened her arms, pulling both children close. James crouched beside her, his big hands resting on their shoulders. "These are happy tears, sweetheart," Lizzie said. She met James's eyes, and he gave a small nod. "James has asked us to be his family. What do you think of that?" Thomas's eyes went wide, a mix of surprise and relief flashing across his young face. He looked at James long and hard, as if measuring him. Then he gave a solemn nod. "I think that'd be all right." Emma's response was simpler. She threw her arms around James's neck. "Does that mean you'll be our papa?" James's breath caught, but he held her tight. "If you'll have me, little one. If you'll both have me." "We will," Emma declared. "Forever and ever." Thomas, less demonstrative but no less sincere, placed his small hand in James's. "You already feel like family," he said quietly. James blinked back tears as he clasped the boy's hand firmly. And it settled. The wedding came. Quickly, as frontier weddings often did. The entire town turned out for it, filling the little church that had once turned Lizzie away. Reverend Thornby's sermon was short but heartfelt, his voice trembling as he spoke of second chances and the courage of those who had walked through loss and found love. Again, Lizzie wore a dress sewn from fabric donated by the women of the valley. Soft blue wool trimmed with lace that once belonged to Clara Calder. Emma carried wildflowers gathered from the meadow, while Thomas stood proud at James's side, his chin high, his shoulders squared like a man twice his age, when James and Lizzie spoke their vows, their voices steady despite the tears in their eyes. The entire congregation seemed to lean forward, as if the very walls of the church longed to witness the healing of two broken hearts. Afterward, the celebration spilled into the ranch yard. Tables laden with food, fiddles playing, laughter rising into the crisp winter air. Emma twirled with ribbons in her hair. Thomas joined the ranch hands in a mock roping contest, and James never let Lizzie drift more than a few steps from his side. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the snow in gold and rose, James pulled Lizzie aside. Together they stood on the porch, watching their children chase barn cats through the snow-dusted yard, their laughter ringing out like bells. "This," James said, his arm tightening around her waist, "this is what I thought I'd never have again." Lizzie leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "And this is what I prayed for, though I didn't dare believe it would come." He kissed her hair, breathing in the warmth of her presence. "We'll make this a home, Lizzie. Not just for us, but for anyone who's ever been turned away in the cold. This ranch won't be a place of ghosts anymore. It'll be a place of light." She smiled through her tears. "Then let's keep the lamp burning, James, always." The stars came out one by one, clear and brilliant in the Wyoming sky. The ranch, once lonely and hollow, now glowed with lamplight and laughter. And in that golden glow, beneath the endless prairie sky, a widow, her children, and a sorrowing cowboy found what they had thought forever lost: love, safety, and a home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join us again for another Wild West tale, where love and courage conquer even the darkest frontier nights.